Welcome to the Parable Arrows podcast, where we wrestle with story to seek deeper truth. We believe that engaging with the art of the world can help us discern more of what God, as the true artist, is trying to reveal in the beauty of his story. Join us as we discuss movies, ideas, and practice engaging with art, God's word, our thoughts, and each other. Hey, welcome again to the Parables Arrows podcast. My name is Femi Shikoya. I'm joined by my co-host, Josh.
Yes.
Today, we are recording our September episode right after we recorded our August episode, mostly because September is a little bit crazy. There's some things going on with me for work, the beginning of the school year. So We wanted to make sure we still got out some type of content, but scheduling for a weekend recording with all the things that go on in the month of September, we're just like, you know what? Let's give the people something that they might want. But do it in a more efficient fashion for us. So that is part of what we're doing. So I wanted to give that context. One of the things that was going on with movies through the end of July, August 2024, which is the time that we're in right now, was a lot of movies were sequels that were coming out. A lot of movies that were coming out direct to Netflix. And some of them just were not that great or were heavily panned when they came out. One of them had a huge cast, huge big ticket cast, big ticket production, and got panned. Don't want to call out the movie because if you like it, great, you like it. That's your cup of tea. But it made Josh think, so, hey, this is something that might be a good discussion. And I thought for our September episode, we could sort of have another interview style episode. We've done one of those in the past and talk through some of the questions that might be helpful for us to think through as these type of things happen in the larger entertainment industry and we consume these things. What are things to talk about? So I'm going to ask Josh a couple questions. Josh, you still game?
Here we go.
Enter into the danger zone.
Yeah, buddy.
Danger zone. All right. So first thing, what in your opinion are why some bad things get made?
Because people are bad. No, that's a terrible answer. No, I have, and if my family listens to this specific episode, they will laugh. I have started a lot of family fights in the past because I was very opinionated about movies being very good or very bad, and I would not let other people tell me otherwise. And so I've had to kind of nuance it over time. And one of the things I've observed is I do think, especially as I've participated in my own creations, sometimes things just go sideways. You have a vision, you think this is what it takes, you're seeing it perfectly, you have all the set pieces around you to make the thing as you thought it should be made. It's going, and then there's this catalytic moment where something happens that just derails everything. And you're left at a moment where you're like, well, have we told everybody about this thing? Yep. Is this thing not going to be nearly as good as people thought it was going to be? Yep. Should we release it anyway? Yep. And then there you go. And then you've got this thing that gets put out and, people kind of aren't sure what to do with. And so that's kind of like the empathetic side of me is, people are genuinely trying to do their best work and maybe people expected too much or even when we say bad things getting made, is it bad because critics didn't like it? Is it bad because audience didn't like it? That's kind of a messy line that isn't super clear, but yeah. I think objectively in terms of, I'm thinking of bad in terms of art quality. I'm watching something, it doesn't grip me. It is feeling like the same movie I've seen 100 times with a different skin. It feels low budget or even high budget with low budget moments. Thor: Love and Thunder is a great example of that, where multi-million-dollar movie, and then there's scenes in it where it's like, who did your CGI? Like a fifth grader? So stuff like that, where it's just there's some things that are the quality's missing and some things aren't adding up. So that's my thought. But answer one, the empathetic side of me, things just happen and things just go wrong and people expect a lot and people want good things and it just doesn't measure up. The cynical side of me is bad things get made because it's usually tied to what the producers or company funding the film think is going to make easy money. So for, the film industry is an industry, they make money like other people. So they put money into making, X movie for $20 million, and they're doing it because they anticipate they will make $40 million, which means that they made $20 million, which to them is great. But when you have a bad movie, there's things that get made that I think people think like, oh, for example, I'm going to make X movie about a video game franchise that is very popular, which is definitely not an allusion to the movie that Femi was mentioning is what drove this conversation. And let me stack it with a huge cast, and let me not really make a good movie that stands in its own right. It's just connected to something that people love, and people are naive enough to just overlook what is going to be the quality of the movie, and they'll just see it because it's a part of this franchise that they enjoy. I think that's the cynical side of me. I think, sadly, that is the proportionately more high reason why bad things get made, or quote unquote, like universally agreed upon bad things are made. But I do want to acknowledge that there are some things that get produced that stuff just didn't work out, and that happens because I've had those projects, and it's awful. But
yeah, well, one of the things you mentioned were like what the definitions of bad and how arguments can start with people when they have different definitions. I think I want to couch when we're talking about bad, we're talking about quality, like the quality of the content was bad. The content itself was bad. Of what they were talking about didn't make sense, or the subject matter or what they did. It was a movie about, a father and a son, and everything was like, sex scenes or violence. And you're like, well, that's not really a father or son movie anymore.
Right, exactly.
Or the impact where the movie is trying to say something and the quality and the content might be okay, but it doesn't actually get anything in the cultural zeitgeist of what it was really trying to talk about. Like a bad documentary could be one of those things where its impact was not really helpful. So want to do that. And then to your point about the investment into art and how some people have a lot of money and they're like, oh, I could put $3 million into this and get $7 million out of it. That's a big win for me. What are elements of the art ecosystem that neither of us are fully in, but that make it harder to navigate? And a couple of options I put in here are investor goals. The time to complete. If there's a hard deadline, you don't want to put a Christmas movie out on July 4th.
Dude, that'd be awesome.
Unrelatable.
let's pocket that idea. I love that idea.
An unrelatable message. So it's really core to the artist, but it's not relatable or easy to relate to other people, or the artist's growth journey. So sometimes somebody starts out and they're 17 and they don't really know how to make something good, but they get better as time goes on. So their early stuff might not work, or they change as life goes on. They were a person who was, doing every which way in the third when they were in their early 20s, and now they're 40s something and have a kid in middle school, and the content they make is different. So what are some of those elements, just as guesses, what are some of the elements that make it hard to navigate what we create and what we put out?
Yeah. So again, a lot of similar to our last interview episode, which I don't think we've published yet, but we're hoping to do something with that. I talked about a lot of just my personal experience, having done things for my school, having worked in the marketing field, making my own art, and time is huge. That is like, to me, one of the biggest ones. So if I'm trying to make, let's say like Dune 2 in a month, it's not going to turn out well. Or everyone who was a part of that movie is not going to come near making another movie ever again because they're going to be so
challenge
angry.
accepted.
And, yeah, exactly. So the reason being that because a movie like Dune, it has a very specific style. That style needs to be replicated using very specific equipment, very specific locations, tech, actors, actresses, costumes. There's certain direction that needs to happen. There's certain preparation, especially I know Dune has some like other languages that are used, or just like, there's these little nuances that like just like in an organization, it takes someone to do that job and to do it well for a whole group, and for that whole group to then execute on a unified vision to then make whatever they're making. And so if your timeline is too ambitious and it's just, we're going to do this in like a week, well, then yeah, like I can't remake Star Wars in a week. It's not going to go well. You're going to get a lot of like bad green screen and cardboard boxes for spaceships and stuff like that. But if there's more time involved, it gives me more space to think about how do I use my resources effectively? How do we maybe try something, keep going, adjust, correct, like still managing your resources well. It's not as much of a like pressure cooker. I think unrelatable message that's a weird one because to me, I think sometimes like I've had this with a couple movies that I've gone back and watched where when I watched it after a certain season of life, when I originally saw it, not relatable to me at all. But then years later, I was like, this movie is incredible. Like, how did no one, it's a weird dynamic. So I don't want to necessarily make that a negative, but I think that can be a risk involved is if you're making something that you almost know this message is not an evergreen message. This is a very specific message for a moment in time. And it may not even be a moment in time that will have rippling effects, that we're like still thinking about. I think of like dystopian movies where, like beware of corporations. And then now we're kind of, we're just repeating that cycle of everything being like beware of corporations type thing. And then the last one, this one's really interesting to me because I was just talking to a friend about like Jordan Peele, for example, where has a start in comedy, is doing like sketch comedy with Keegan-Michael Key, is renowned for some of the characters he plays. And then he comes out and makes some of like the greatest horror movies that have ever been made. And I think there is something in the artistic journey that can actually be a huge benefit to the art ecosystem and like how that influences things, because I'm so thankful I have movies like Get Out and Nope because of Jordan Peele not doing comedy anymore. But I also think that can sometimes make it really difficult for the artist, where if there's this, I think of like the Christian hip hop industry, there's always been these expectations of like Lecrae where, well, you made this kind of music and now you're making this kind of music. So that means this about you. And so there's this kind of identity that artists have to deal with where it's like, well, you're the horror movie guy. You can't go making like rom-coms now, and so there's these arbitrary rules. And then, that can sometimes feed into producers being like, well, you're a really talented guy, but they want you to make horror movies, not rom-coms. And then the guy's like, well, I don't want to make horror movies. I want to make rom-coms. So he tries to make a horror movie rom-com and it just falls apart because it's, too many people trying to drive the bus and doesn't really go anywhere. So that is my hot take.
Yeah.
But for you, Femi, on your end, like what do you have you feel like has been maybe one of the most influential effectors on the movie ecosystem of like the quality of things getting made maybe in the last like 5 years, we'll say, to keep it relevant? Like, what do you think is one of the big ones?
No love or hate to John Mulaney, but one of his jokes was just spot on. He found out the budget of a movie was like $100 million.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, wait, if you put $100 million in a stack in a room, I would pay $5 just to see the stack. Like that's an immense amount of money to put into a movie. I think as we've seen a little bit of pacification of American society, the really tempting thing when you are an artist is to allow your skill to be used as an investment potential too much. $100 million is a ton of money for a movie, right? There are kids who make movies, full-length movies with like 20 grand, right? But they don't have people in wetsuits and water scenes and color correction in the CGI and an entire company and ecosystem like Weta or any of the major motion picture studios that are helping with special effects. So I think that the more money that gets into a thing, the harder it is for it to stay quote unquote pure. And applaud people like Jordan Peele and James Cameron, who probably had the ideas much earlier, but to your point about time, they had to wait until it was proven all of these skills that they already had in their ideas. They're like they had to do, like Jordan Peele did comedy for so long that he probably had a lot of closed doors when he brought some of his first projects up, when he was ready for them, when he knew what he wanted to do. And James Cameron said like the technology was just not in place for the first Avatar movie. Like there's no way I could have filmed it when I wanted to film it because there was no way these
Could
things
you
existed.
imagine like 2000s Avatar?
Oh my gosh, it would have been so
Yuck.
bad. I didn't even love Avatar, and I was just sort of like, man, like
Space Pocahontas. That's what my friend called it.
yeah, it's very similar. I think I got the exact same thing. But I respect them for the grind. It's just money is in it, you know, and to like capture a vision of a fantasy or like world that doesn't exist. Harry Potter, the first movie compared to the last movie, artistically just got better. So I think those are some things that really challenge people. And to your point about time is huge. If I'm trying to make a return in 6 years, I can't wait 7. And if somebody has something ready for me, I might take it, even though it might not be as good as the thing that might walk in the door next. And now I'm committed, you know?
Yep.
So I think that's
and I think something else that just came to mind too is the idea of how money is spent. Because I'm a big fan of Corridor Digital, so they are more in the special effects industry on YouTube, and so they do a really cool segment where they'll have different either directors or special effects artists or animators like come and they sit on a couch and they break down all these animation scenes and stuff like that. And they were doing one for the show Invincible, which is based on a comic. And the animator was like literally talking about, he's like, oh, they blew all their budget on this one 30-second stretch or like this one 3 seconds of animation. And then you see the lack of budget in the rest of the animation. And so there's this idea of like, okay, so I could pay, you know, let's say I have a $200 million budget. I could pay $50 million and have, I don't know, Tom Holland in it if he'll sign on for that much money, you know, as for the contract. But then the rest of the money to like pay a really good cinematographer and pay a really good costume designer and to pay a really good script writer and to pay a really good grip to do the lighting and all this stuff. Yeah, there you go. That's what ends up happening is all of a sudden, well, just like a real life budget, like if, you know, I put all my money into Nike shoes and shirts, it's like, well, where's our money for our food then? Right? So what you spend your money on means you're not spending it on something else. And I think that happens a lot in the movie industry. And I think that's my hot take. One of the reasons that I think Marvel movies have declined a lot is you can get the sense that it almost feels rushed when you watch it, where it's just like everything's moving so fast and everything feels like, okay, like why does it seem like this moment right here is shot beautifully? And then 5 seconds later, it feels like I'm watching a completely different movie that was made by like a bunch of high school kids in a back room. Like this isn't jarring with me. And so then all of a sudden we have
high school kids if they did.
Very, very, very skilled, but high school kids nonetheless. So I think, just even the idea of like money and time, and it's all a giant spider web of things that is constantly changing and shifting all the time, which is what makes making really good art so hard, let alone something that speaks to a culture enough to return on, you know, the money you put into it.
Yeah. So I got 2 more questions and I'm going to turn all of this on its head in a little bit.
Boy.
Very quickly, but let's go with question 4 and then question 3.
Sure.
Is it right to criticize people when a major budget piece comes out? When something flops and it costs $220 million and it only makes, you know, nothing to sneeze at, but like 170, loses 50 million, right? Like you're just like, oh man, I wish I could have used some of that money for my project. Oh man, I wish I could have used some of that money for me. Is it right to criticize people if they are unsuccessful in the venture, right?
Yeah.
Whether it be artistically or financially.
Yeah. I really struggle with this because especially as an educator, as a teacher, this is maybe a insight into me a little bit, but I have a much easier time being gracious and encouraging to my students if they do something way below their work level, but they tried really, really hard. So it's like, I've never done this before. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just going to try it and see what happens. And it's like, dude, you did something. Maybe it didn't go perfectly, but like you set out and you tried it and now you just learn from this and you go forward. Then there's the other side where you're like frustrated when you can tell that there's a kid who's showing up and they could be doing amazing things, but they're like, nah, I don't feel like it. I don't want to. No, it's just dumb. This is a waste of time. You know, that attitude is like, oh, like you're grating on me because I know that there's so much in you that you just don't want to give to this for whatever reason. And I think I've had to grow in this over the last few years, but I've had to become more nuanced in my criticism of things. So I would be way more forgiving of like a low budget indie film that's like trying to do something really cool that maybe doesn't quite pull it off as well as I thought they could. But like, hey, they did the best that they could with the things that they have. Versus like, I tend to be really critical when names like Marvel and Disney and some of those juggernauts come into the mix, because in my mind, I'm like, you have the people and you have the time and you have the money. You're just choosing not to. So that's kind of my brain. I don't know if that's right. I would say, I think it really comes down to the purpose of the criticism in my mind. I don't like when people criticize something for the sake of just being superior to it. But I think there's something deeply healthy, especially as consumers, to criticize something with the intent to be like, so for me, as I've become more critical with film and with movies and TV and music and stuff like that, I've actually saved myself a lot of time because I don't just watch anything. Like I'm very specific about like, what do I expect and is it meeting that expectation? So I think that criticism can be helpful, but to be disparaging and be like, this guy's trash because his movie only made this much money, like I don't think that's necessary, and I don't think that that's really fair, because in a lot of jobs, you know, we'll play sideline, name the job title, and tell everybody all the things that we would have done, but then our job is like nowhere even near the ballpark of the thing that we're critiquing. So for me to like critique, you know, who I love his films, by the way, but Taika Waititi, if I were to, you know, I took a jab at Thor Love and Thunder, like that man knows way more than me about making movies. Like he does. Are there some things that I may be right about in my criticism? Like, sure, I'm confident in that. But there's also some things that I probably have no clue of what's going on. And so when I bring up my criticism and I ask the purpose, I have to be there needs to be a balance of like, what is this for? And like, why am I doing this? And, you know, kind of that deeper heart issue. Mm-hmm. But how about you? What do you think? I feel like that's an interesting question of like, is it right? That's a very,
I think that sometimes people feel like it's a either or, like these people got that money and I didn't. Therefore, if they don't do everything that I would have done with it, I have the right to say this is not good. I think I would criticize based off of like complexity and time to solve sometimes. So with Sonic, when Sonic the Hedgehog movie came out, still haven't seen it. But they fixed Sonic to make him look more like the video game character in like a matter of weeks because of the backlash they got from a trailer. I was like, you can fix it that fast? Huh. Okay. So
I have a theory about that, but
it could be a marketing play or whatever. Yeah. But like,
I think it was a marketing scam.
At the same time, like, I think they do have the time. I remember Kevin Spacey with all the money in the world getting replaced by Christopher Plummer. I think there's a lot of time to edit things. I think there's a lot of fixes that people can make and a lot of things they know they can change. And editing is a really hard job. I think when you're really close to something, it can be hard. And the bigger the thing is, sometimes the harder it can be. But I think it's, to your point about the nuance, it's right to criticize it for the thing that it does badly. Not because of jealousy, not because of your impatience for your own journey, and not because they are inhuman in the way that they do things. I don't think you can criticize on those factors. If it's an indie film and I love it, and the cinematography is bad, the camera work is bad, the camera work is bad. That is objective. It doesn't matter that I want to give grace to it. You need to get better at your camera work because it impacts your story. And your story was excellent. And your characters were good. And your character development was good. But I'm criticizing the thing that was actually bad. I think how you criticize also matters. But I think it's right to criticize something for what it is, not because it's a major budget piece. right? Like, not because it's a cash grab. It can be a cash grab. That's fine. Like, that's what a cash grab is. It's a cash grab. But what are you criticizing? The fact that it's the, fifth in the series, or because the characters fell flat, the writing was bad, the dialogue was bad. That's what I think people should think about. And to deal with the jealousy and impatience for your own journey and things, what would you say is encouragement for someone who hasn't, quote unquote, arrived in the art world? And by arrived, because that can mean many, many different things, I'm talking about somebody who's stable enough in their art as a source of revenue, then they know they will be able to retire from the revenue they create from their art.
Yeah. Dude, this is such a really good but really personal question, because this has been part of my journey and struggling. I think remembering that you are not as good as you think you are, but you're also not as bad as you think you are, and to just be truthful with yourself at the point in the journey that you're in. So there's a lot of times where I probably could have pulled certain things off if I had the time or the capacity to do things a little bit better in different projects I've made. But the reality is, like, I also probably had a pretty swelled head at the time of what I thought I could pull off. And like, part of the reason I couldn't pull that off is because I couldn't pull that off. So I think just remembering and taking each moment as like, or each stage of your journey, whether it's in terms of your skill set, like how good I am at making something, or even just thinking of people buying into what you're doing. And actually, Femi, you've been the one who has said this, which has been an encouragement that stuck with me, is like, what you make is not who you are. And so therefore people's reaction to what you make does not determine its worth. And I think sometimes, you could do a sketch on a napkin at a bar, and like, that might be your favorite piece of art you've made all week. And that's totally fine. And like, people should embrace that, because it's you creating, getting better, like honing your skill, being in the moment, maybe even sharing that with someone and lighting up their day. But there is also a level of like, you should try to get better, like get better in the time that you're waiting for maybe some of those doors to open. Like, don't think that you are as good as you wish you were, think you are. Like, improve, be humble, have a little bit of a fire to see how you can get better. I don't know if there's anything else I would say. That's kind of the big one for me, is just humility. Like, remembering like we're not as good at things as we think we are.
Yeah. It's something that's so important for people to realize, like, everybody has a journey, and just because someone has seemingly an accelerated journey doesn't mean they didn't have like some real big licks along the way. And sometimes people pick to avoid certain licks, like schmooze and stuff like that. The reason I said I was going to flip all this on its head is because going over these questions again, it's like, oh, this is somebody's also church journey too. Like, okay, why did bad things get made? Why do bad churches exist? Bad churches exist because of a variety of factors. I'm not going to list them all out right now. They could be here forever. But what are the elements that make it harder to navigate how a church is functioning? A local economy. It could be people's jobs in the area. It could be a plant closed down where, a third of the church used to work for that plant or that company. It could be the age of the population of the church. It could make it hard for them to reach a different age demographic. Somebody that we know was applying for jobs as a associate pastor, and there would be churches that it would go to, and they'd say, oh, we want you to come in because you're young and you can bring in a whole lot of young people, but just don't change anything that we do. It's like, I think the reason you don't have young people,
that's sure what they want to
is
hear,
because you're not willing to change.
Yeah,
anything.
exactly.
So it can make it really hard to navigate. The fourth question, is it right to criticize a pastor or church staff when something bad is happening? Well, like, why are you criticizing them? Is it because it's just not serving you? Is it because they really need to go to the gospel? And then criticize accurately. You are not preaching the Bible anymore. You're preaching opinions. You're preaching topically. You're preaching blah, 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 blah. And then what's encouragement to someone who feels like they're not at a place where they can navigate this ecosystem of church well? It's like, you got to be humble. You got to be patient. and realize, as somebody who's a project manager, deadlines, like you mentioned, deadlines make us create to the deadline. And you and I have both been in a situation where we're like, okay, let's write this many stories by the end of the year. And the stories were not as good because they were great premises, but they were horrible in the execution because we were racing to the deadline. And we were not. And so I have a lot of grace for TV shows and movies that are racing towards deadlines that they did not set too. Have grace because your life is not a deadline. You do not have to be some type of level of holy in the next 5 years. If you become a believer or if you've just moved to a new area, you do not have to be a leader in that church in so much time. Your pastor does not have to make sure that there's this type of sermon in this much time. It is huge and complex. Have grace for the bad art. Be able to articulate what the actual problem is. The writing was bad. The editing of good writing was bad. The cinematography was like whatever. But there were still a lot of people who worked together and put this thing out, and that took guts and time and sacrifice. And they have to make decisions about what they're going to do next. And I can watch their journey and see if they try to do better or not. So trust the fact that churches that are bad, like, are bad for a reason. Sometimes you stay a little bit to figure out, like, no, this is really starting to implode and I need to say something and be brave about saying it accurately. But not just because they didn't have your worship set one Sunday,
or you didn't like the chairs or whatever,
or they changed how he loves from sloppy wet to unforeseen. Like,
how dare you? Hey, hold on.
Like, these things are really hard, and we want to talk about it because it is sometimes a little bit like grating when you see something bad come out and you're like, man, if that was my job, I would have XYZ. It's hard. When you see a church do the same thing, it's hard. Have grace. Understand that there are a lot of factors at play. And again, as we said this in the rollerball episode month before, it's this idea of what level of self-sacrifice, like our Savior had, are you willing to do to try to improve it? Or are you just backseat driving, sideline coaching? You're not getting in the game, and the game is hard on you. It's really hard, and count the cost.
Yeah, and to the, like you said, the art and the church side, I think that idea of, to the criticism question, that's the question I wanted to go to, is, if, like, for me, I have a really hard time criticizing something that I'm not willing to do something about. So, like, if I'm I tend to be really critical of movies and stuff and stories because I'm, like, actively trying to write better movies and stories. Like, that's a goal I have. Or if you're in church and you see something that's wrong and you're like, man, like, this should be better. Like, there's a way that this could be better and do whatever. Like, maybe that criticism, and you're seeing that because that's something that God has equipped you to see, and that's your lane to maybe better the thing that you're wishing could be better. And I think that's something too that I just have wondered about church culture as well, is like how criticism is such like it's a very messy word, because I feel like if you correct or criticize, or you're telling someone, don't do this, you shouldn't wear that, you shouldn't behave this way, it can come off as like judgy or like, being like a Pharisee. But then also, if you just let everybody do everything, it's also not good, and that doesn't really hold the standard of what the church is supposed to be in terms of just like representing a unified body. So I wonder with like the criticizing part, like sometimes criticizing something in a healthy way and then keeping it inside and then like praying through, okay, God, like, what would you have me do with this criticism I have? Is it an action? Is it speaking up? Is it praying over it? Is it releasing it to you? Is it to maybe see that I have a trauma that's buried deep under there that is causing this criticism? Like, there's so many different threads that could be like working that kind of thing inside of us. And so like when something like that pops up, it's not to say never criticize anything, but also kind of like we were saying, like how and why you are criticizing can potentially be life-changing for you, but it could also do it in the opposite and be really destructive.
Yeah. Also, I want to add the value of understanding before speaking.
Mm-hmm.
I would. This is a slightly personal story, but like, when I was in college, I was a straight A student coming out of high school, and I got really frustrated by one of my lab TAs who was from China, and my lab professor was from Russia, and I was getting like B minuses on things, and just frustrated with like how I was doing in lab, and wasn't really going to office hours. But I realized as I was going to office hours and sat with this person who it was their mandated time while they were coming from a country that was a 14-hour flight away, while my home was an hour flight away, that they had trouble speaking like perfect English, not just in lab or grading my paper to explain what I did wrong, but they had trouble speaking all the time at the grocery store. Like, they had trouble getting paperwork done. They had to do more paperwork than I had to do. And it was in a language that was their second or maybe even third language. And it just gave me a whole different perspective to go, the problem that I think I see as the problem, the criticism on a levy, is one where I don't have full visibility into what's going on behind the scenes. So even before I act and say something, do I understand why my pastor is exhausted? Is it their fault that they're exhausted, or is it this thing because 7 people have died in the last 2 months and they've been at all the funerals on Saturdays and planning and meeting with all these families, and they're emotionally beat down because their own family is going through trauma or stress, and I'm expecting them to stand up and say something perfectly about this passage that I've heard since I was a kid. Like, really, really understand in the criticism of art that artist is going through stuff, and your church members and pastors are going through stuff. So we want to say that because you should criticize things. Mm-hmm. You should say accurately when something is bad. It's bad. But you better know why a little bit, because that's the most helpful type of call out. It's not helpful to just say it's bad, I know, and like not know the reason why or how you can help make it better. That's why we seek the good of the city. You know, we seek the good of the city, even though the city is jacked up sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and I think something important too is we're talking about the idea of criticism, because I know for me, part of my journey has been how to navigate criticism, because I'm a pretty sensitive soul. And so I take criticism really deeply. And so something I've had to figure out is, what do I need to do so that when someone criticizes me or like offers something or asks a good question, what do I need to do to approach this to discern, instead of in the moment deciding that they said something, that's criticism and it's a mean criticism and I don't have to hear it. Like, what's my action step to discern if this is healthy criticism or not? Like, is this a person who really deeply loves me and is trying to coach me, and maybe, you know, right or wrong, out of love, they're trying to help me see something? And what is criticism that's like, oh, you just have a bone to pick and you're just mad at me? And it's like, and for me, one of those things has been to just be curious. So like when someone asks something, if I start asking follow-up questions, it's like, oh, yeah, when did you first start noticing that? Like, has that been a pattern for a while that you've noticed that I do that? Because you know what, I haven't noticed that, but now that you're saying it, you know, like, when did you notice this? Or like, you know, oh, what other impacts do you know anyone? Do you just be curious and you ask them questions? And if they don't have answers, or they start just kind of like spiraling around and they're not really telling you anything, they're just like, well, you just like shouldn't do that. And you're like, you don't really have a reason. You just don't like something, or you just don't like me or what I'm trying to do. Versus it's like, well, I understand what you're trying to do and it's this, but I just wanted to be honest with you that when I read this or heard this or saw this, this is kind of what came out to me and like whatever. And I was like, whoa, totally didn't mean that, but thank you for saying that, because now I can kind of think about that in the future. And so I think, yeah, it's a two-way street of like giving criticism graciously, but also receiving it graciously, and also not just taking any criticism as gospel. Like, that's important too.
And realizing that people can have those different things, I think to that specific artist taking criticism piece, someone can not like a thing you make. And again, you still have made it the exact way you wanted to make it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really hard, because if you don't have a healthy understanding of separation, that person just might not like the color blue as much as you like blue. And you created the exact thing you wanted to create, and it's blue, and you love it. And they would have made it orange, right? That they can tell you, oh, I loved it, except blue's not a really great color. I really think it would have been better orange. For you to be able to go, thank you. I did exactly what I wanted to do, and blue is the color I wanted. But I hear you that you'd like a version of it in orange because that's something you would like. Do you want me to do a digital copy and recolor in orange so you can have that version? Because that would be something for you that I would help create. But this is what I wanted to create because it says what I wanted to say and do. Right? And dialogue is really hard for that. I know even we have looked at each other's dialogue and certain things we've written and been like, oh, I would have said it differently.
Mm-hmm.
And realizing like, that's not the right way. Is this how you wanted to say? Because this is what I picked up.
Mm-hmm.
That curiosity you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And somebody was like, yeah, that's what I wanted and how I want to say it. I was like, cool. Then that's what I got.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, if that's what you were going for, this might be easier for you to use as in, oh, thank you. Now you've made it better.
Mm-hmm.
But not just like, I wouldn't have said it that way.
Yeah.
Like,
well, why not? I don't know. It just bothers me. It's like,
is it right? Or like, oh, this is better. It's like, why is it better? It's like, well, it's clear for somebody like you.
Yeah.
Got you.
Yep.
Okay. This is not written for you. That's why children's books are written at the level they're written. They're not written for a PhD.
No, Femi, they should be written for smarter children who have 12th grade lexicons. What are we doing here?
Yeah. So all of those things factor into, again, knowing why you're criticizing a thing and is it accurate, right? Someone asked a really gotcha question to our astronaut. It's like, hey, I see what you did with the passage, but like, I don't really get that from reading the passage. It seems like you pulled like some sort of a preacher trick. Like, how did you get that? And he's like, you're right. It's not really in the passage. This is what I was thinking of when I was reading the passage, and this is why, and this is how it connects, but was really honest about it because the person was sort of gracious and going like, hey, look, I didn't really see that. It wasn't like a gotcha. It was just I didn't really see that. With art, those are the questions that we have. I'm like, why did you do it that way? Like, why have we not made a good Garfield movie yet? Like,
that is a great question.
You know, what is our struggle with it? Mm-hmm. Or why certain people haven't made a TV show, but they've made this TV show, or why this person acts and this person can't act anymore, or like all these other things. That curiosity is important in assessing art and our faith journey and faith communities, because we can be really sensitive sometimes without meaning to be. But yeah, I thought I could take that conversation from
Dude, it's good stuff.
The movie that will not be named, and then also spin it back into, again, there's these connections and stories in art all the time.
The movie was Super Mario Bros, by the way, not the new one.
Yeah,
the 80s, the 80s version. That's what I meant.
If you want to sponsor us, though, I'm just saying, I'm not saying the name. I'm just saying I have questions. I just got questions for you.
We have some concerns. We're concerned
for you because I care. Do you believe me? Do you believe that I care?
No.
So.
No, I don't.
But we really do appreciate you all letting us sort of do some of these. We are going to try this because it's easier for us to get some content out and some thoughts out to you as well. I'm going to pray to close real quick, and then we will sign off. Heavenly Lord, Father, we thank you for the ability to think through art. We thank you that you are a God who uses not only historical story, but parables as a way to communicate truth to us, your people, and make us think. God, please help us to continue to be people who want to renew our minds, to not be sensitive to personal attacks as creators and people who are creative and have skills, or any type of skill, not even just creative art skills. Help us to avoid the sensitivity that comes from not being willing to listen, knowing that we are all worthy of the criticism of you and not being perfect, and help us to use that to assess the things that look bad in the world, to be curious, to see where you're acting, where you're not, and to seek the good, God, to seek the good of where we are and to really be pushing for it and not to be too afraid to do so, even as flawed people. God, we thank you for the ability to enjoy art, and we thank you for the ability to be in Christian community. And so we also pray for all of the Christian communities and all the ways that they struggle, and not just to criticize them and the ways that they fail and the way that we fail in them, but to, again, push them and spur them on to beauty and to be a part of your tools of healing and restoration and revelation. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, everybody.
Dope. Peace. This episode was produced by Josh Erickson, Josh Cook, and Femi Shokoya, and edited by Josh Erickson. Our social media producer is Colton Mefford. We are currently self-supported. You can check out short stories, merch, and highlighted creators at parablearrows.com. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok at Parable Arrows or support us on Patreon. Thank you for listening to the Parable Arrows podcast. Think, move in faithfulness, and trust God. Pull back, aim high, let it fly.